I'm going to do how should I put it, a pretty general opening, and I really am going to begin by going back to basics. And I thought a good starting point would be Steven Pinker's Angels of Our Nature, subtitle Why Violence Has Declined. That was published in 2012. Steven Pinker is one of these bourgeois optimists, and his basic thesis is that life has become incredibly less violent than compared with the past, which might well be true. If you look at the streets of London, for example, today, compared with 1500 or 1000 AD, as I was brought up to say. On the other hand, I thought it was quite marvelous in terms of his introductory remarks. Is he says, "Well, I'm not going to deal with the ancient past," and what he means by the ancient past is anything from human origins, basically up to the Neolithic. So, in other words, I don't know how long the human species, depends how you define us, but roughly speaking, we've been on planet Earth in terms of Homo sapiens, say for about 250,000 years. And so Steven Pinker wants to discount, roughly speaking, about 240,000 of those years. And I think the reason why he wants to do that is it wouldn't fit with his thesis that things are getting better. Because if you look at archaeologists, there's a sort of general agreement that it's with the Neolithic, roughly speaking. And of course, that's not a global thing, but roughly speaking, 10,000 or 12,000 or whatever years ago, what we have is pretty peaceful conditions. And indeed, the only evidence of systematic violence that we've got really dates from around about 20,000 years ago. And you can come across sites of basically massacres. Not very frequently, I hasten to add, but there is evidence of what we would assume to be war, i.e., collective burials, not in any sort of ritualistically respectful way, with arrow and spearheads in the bones and fractures to the skull. So if you look at the work of anthropologists and paleontologists, there's sort of general agreement that amongst hunter-gatherers, while violence, interpersonal violence, is certainly there is no evidence of between hunter-gatherers of anything that we could legitimately call war. Let me just add the point that if we look at the Neolithic, often it's talked about as the Neolithic revolution, because what we saw is much more advanced tool making, but also what we saw, which is why I would certainly describe it not as a revolution, but a counter-revolution, is evidence of the systematic oppression of women. That goes hand in hand with the rise of cattle herding, agriculture, and also war, which goes hand in hand not only with killing people, but enslaving people. So we have a situation of where not only are women oppressed, but certain groups of men, and it is men, live off the exploitation of slaves and other oppressed sections of the population. Okay, so having mentioned war, how would we define war? And I would basically take Clausewitz on his book on war as my starting point, and would simply describe war as the continuation of policy. That's the policy of a particular class or a particular state, and its violence on an extended scale. So that means numbers, and it also means time. So I wouldn't describe a fight between two would-be alpha males as war. I would simply call that interpersonal violence. Okay, so with the Neolithic, we also see the rise of states. States develop bureaucracies, but also what they develop is what we call armed bodies of men. And we're not talking simply about the population. So amongst hunter-gatherers, all males would be armed with bow and arrow, knives, spears, or what have you, in order to hunt, for example. It's simply, part of what it's about being human, I suppose. But no, under class society, what we get is not so much the population as a whole armed in order to get their means of subsistence. What arises is special bodies of armed men. And in particular, what I'm thinking about is a warrior class, a class of people who are dedicated to war, who train in the arts of war from a very early age. Now, this particular class has a real function in society. It's not simply parasitic, that if, for example, for whatever reason, the society is turned to agriculture, there's always a temptation for those on the outside when it comes to harvests being stored to invade and raid and take away the harvest. So yes, you need, in these Neolithic times, you need an armed force. But what we're talking about here is an armed force that isn't just carrying out the function of defense. What we're talking about is a particular body of armed men that is also living parasitically off the labor of others. In other words, a class. And this really brings me to the title of the opening, and that is the question of just wars. Thinking about this, I mean, I did my little Wikipedia search, and lo and behold, didn't surprise me that you can go back to ancient Egypt and ancient China, and they had some sort of notion of a just war. But often, their notion of a just war was nothing more than saying, well, the emperor, the pharaoh, their function is not only to defend the territory, their function is to add to the territory, add to the number of slaves, add to the number of tribute payers to the empire. And in terms of justification, what makes their wars just could be nothing more than a convenient reading by priests who you tend to be in charge of, telling you that you're going to go out there and win. So, for example, you cut open a sheep or whatever it happens to be, the priests look at the entrails and they make the prediction that the war that the pharaoh stroke emperor stroke ruler is planning is just, and will end in victory. Well, there are other forms of justification, there's no doubt about that. And what I would pick out in particular amongst the warrior class is this, well, what should we call it? Honor. If their honor is slighted, that then becomes a justification for them to go out and attack the other side. And oh, well, in the course of satisfying their honor, it's just a sort of byproduct of the war that they come back, if they're victorious, with slaves, with booty, and the subordination of the other side in terms of paying a tribute, for example. So in terms of ancient Greece, the warrior class were well aware that whatever the the priests told them, there was always a chance that luck wouldn't be on their side, that they wouldn't triumph, that they would end up being defeated. And of course, they explain that by the capricious nature of the gods. So it wasn't a question of lack of skill, lack of cunning, which they expected both sides to employ. They sort of recognized themselves to be victims of what I would call, using ancient Greek, victim of the fates. The gods stood above them, and they decide ultimately who's going to win and who's going to lose. So you get this sort of, although you get this doctrine of natural slavery, slaves are speaking tools, are subhuman, exist outside society. There's also a recognition amongst some Greek philosophers that if you happen to be a slave, there's also the question of bad luck. So in Greek myths, for example, there's a reoccurring theme of various slaves formerly being a prince or a princess that just happened to find themselves in slavery. And just to illustrate this idea, I think it's worthwhile turning to Homer's Iliad, the famous account. I think it's packed into a couple of months, the actual account, but the account of the 10-year-long war between the Greeks and the Trojans. And of course, what we have in terms of the beginnings of this 10-year war is the Trojan prince Paris falling for the Spartan Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world. They elope, they go to Troy, but the problem is that she's married to this guy, king of Sparta, Menelaus, who happens to also to be the brother of Agamemnon, the chief king in Greece. And of course, Menelaus's honor has been insulted. There's the prince of Troy, going off with his wife. And in revenge, Agamemnon rallies the kings of Greece, and they decide to go over and teach the Trojans a lesson. And of course, what we have behind this account is not only the honor of the warrior class, we actually have a battle of wits and wills going on in Olympus amongst the chief gods, with various gods taking the side of the Trojans, various gods taking the side of the Greeks, various gods punishing various princes and kings for some slight to their honor, for example. But what we get, I think, is very interesting in this account, and I think it's the only reference by name of an ordinary soldier to cites. I've coached myself with Christopher Gray earlier in terms of that pronunciation. He's the guy that gets up in the assembly of the Greeks well into the war, and basically points the finger at the chief, Agamemnon, and says, well, what's this war all about? Why are we fighting? Why are we suffering this horrendous war in order to enrich this man? He's got gold, he's got, bronze, he's got slave girls, he's got captives in order to ransom them. What's he want? Why should we carry on dying in this war? And in terms of the account, of course, he isn't someone who has the sort of physique of the typical warrior, the noble body, which has a noble mind, given his ignoble thoughts, ignoble criticisms. Homer, and I'm saying Homer in inverted commas, describes him as short in stature and bent, and what we have is Odysseus, the king of Ithaca, a modest king, but a very sort of clever mind, who goes on, with the account of returning from Troy, his 10 years of going around the Mediterranean, not being allowed to return home by the gods. But what Odysseus does, because this uppity rank and file soldier hasn't got the scepter that allows the princes to speak one after the other, he beats him over their heads. And in terms of Homer's account, the troops, the General Assembly, cheers and approves. Well, I don't know how much truth there is, of course, in Homer's, I won't call it history, but version of events. But one somehow doubts it. Somehow one doubts that the ordinary rank and file was so enthusiastic when it comes to this war, because it's the princes, it's the kings, it's the warrior class that go back with glory and booty, and the ordinary soldiers, they go back either in debt with their farms ruined, or they simply die in the battle. And this then really brings me, I suppose, to just asking, well, when was war being justified, not so much amongst the elite for the elite, but being justified in terms of by the elite for the masses? I actually don't have an answer, but I think it would have something to do not just with the mobilization of ordinary rank and file soldiers, but an attempt to actually motivate them. And certainly when that becomes problematic in terms of official ideology, I would certainly say that with the Roman Empire adopting Christianity, that certainly becomes a problem. Now, if we look at Roman society, I think you would describe that society as semi-literate, i.e., it wouldn't just be the elite that knew how to read and write. How to read and write would have a trickle-down effect. I'm not saying ordinary people would easily be able to read and write, but often, they knew people who could. So yes, it's true that books or scrolls, would be the property of the elite, and I, of course, include the priest caste in that, i.e., the Catholic Church and other such Christian denominations. But the point about Christianity is that it's a universal religion, and in terms of that religion, it, at least to me, I'm sure this was true when the Roman Empire was adopting Christianity, there's a complete disjuncture between the religion and the nature of the state. So although you have St. Paul and early Christian, and I do mean Christian, writers talking about obey your masters, justifying slavery. But you also have, the stories of Jesus, turn the other cheek, resist not evil. Thou shalt not kill would be pretty much, I know that goes back to an earlier time, but it's not insignificant, surely, that the guy that's accredited with turning the Roman Empire officially to Christianity, not permanently, it's contested, but the guy that's normally credited with this is Constantine. My understanding is that he waits till his deathbed before he converts to Christianity. And that wasn't uncommon. Why? Because Roman emperors, would order at a pretty routine level the execution of prisoners, the torture of prisoners, and other such horrors. So as long as you confessed on your deathbed, we're assured by Christian theology that your sins are forgiven. So you can understand why you would wait to the last moment. And what we have individuals, and I'm just taking them as representative, people like Augustine, St. Augustine of Hippo, starting to come out with the doctrine of just wars. And just wars, of course, are conducted by legitimate rulers. They're done to restore the civil order. They're done for the benefit of society. They're not justified on the level of the honor of the warrior class. They're not justified on the basis of simply getting slaves and booty and subordinating other states, other countries for the purposes of tribute. So at least I would put forward the possibility that this is also something, this also says something about the Roman army, which is also, of course, becoming officially Christian. And certainly when we have feudalism, we have Sir Thomas Aquinas, and again, a much more developed doctrine of just wars. But again, this is to do with legitimate kings blessed by either inheritance or the Pope or something along those lines. So if we look at the development of history, it's still the case that if we look at various states, they don't bother with recourse to the Pope or some notion of going on the Crusades to attack the heathens. It's simply about the interest of the state to defend itself, the interest of the state to defend itself by growing bigger and getting richer. So, for example, I've already quoted Clausewitz on war. He was a Prussian soldier, philosopher at the time of the Napoleonic wars. And while he talked about morale being what we could call a material force in war, you won't find him putting forward some sort of sophisticated doctrine that France or Prussia or Russia fought a legitimate war and therefore deserved to win or deserved to lose. He simply looks at war as the continuation of policy, of politics by violent means. And war is neither more legitimate or less legitimate than the policy carried out peacefully in the previous times. Again, I'm not trying to create some sort of pure version of history with one thing following the other, but precisely trying to point out that what was being justified on the interests of the state also could run in parallel with various states or various classes fighting what they would had considered a just war on the basis of an ideology or a religion, which I take as a form of ideology. And an example of that, for instance, would be the parliamentary army, the Puritan army, the Cromwellian army, which clearly fought, from its point of view, a war against a tyrant, but it was also fighting God's war to bring about God's order on earth. But if we look, for example, at the French Revolution, we're certainly no longer talking about a religious war in any form. What we're talking about is a war of the demos, to use a phrase, of the people, a war carried out for liberty and for the destruction of the feudal chains that are still binding Europe. And it's in that tradition that we need to understand Marxism. The Marxism of Marx and Engels very much come out of the French Revolution, very much live in the shadow of the French Revolution. And for Marx and Engels, they do have a view until they are disabused. And of course, that's pretty early, that the French Revolution will be continued by the bourgeoisie in Europe, in particular in Germany. So if we look at their Communist Manifesto, their perspectives when it comes to the German Revolution, it is very much with the idea that the bourgeoisie is a revolutionary class, that it has an interest in getting rid of feudalism, it has an interest in progressing society. It's a class which the proletariat can ally itself with. It's a class which the proletariat can push forward, but also a class which the proletariat, while it would seek to put in power, the proletariat would seek to carry on that revolution, to use Marx's phrase, a common phrase at the time, would seek to carry through the revolution in permanence. In other words, they would push society towards the extremes of democracy, would push society forward to the point where the working class can realistically become the ruling class. And in that struggle, the working class would ally itself with the petty bourgeoisie, both the urban and rural petty bourgeoisie. So, for example, if you look at the demands of the Communist Party in Germany, you will see the sort of program that they were putting forward. So there is this idea going around, not only in the 19th century, but into the 20th century. In other words, into the formation and throughout the existence of the Second International, that the policy of Marx and Engels when it came to war was always to choose a side, was to look at the progressive side, and the job of the working class was to support that side against the reactionary side. Well, the point I would make about that is twofold. One, if we look at Germany, Marx and Engels were quickly disabused by the bourgeoisie itself of their revolutionary character. They didn't produce a Danton. They didn't produce a Robespierre. They produced, in Marx Engels terms, miserable cowards who wouldn't challenge, who wouldn't challenge the existing power structure in a revolutionary fashion, wouldn't take the revolution to its limits, because they actually were afraid of what happened in France, of course, and that is the sans-culottes, not just the Jacobins, but elements precisely of the masses carrying out their own program. So if we look at the Second International, one of the problems we have to recognize, and this is the second point, is that the writings of Marx and Engels were radically unknown. That if we look at, for example, the most well-known, the most famous, the most widely read work of Marxism, I think I would be right in saying that it would be the section taken from Engels's Anti-Düring that goes under the title of, socialism, utopian and scientific. That would be a pamphlet that would be widely read in the Second International. The Communist Manifesto, Hal Draper's written about its particular fortunes. It would have been known, it would have been published. But if we're looking at the correspondence of Marx and Engels, some of it was published, for example, by Marx's daughter. Of course, we had the publication of volume 1 of Capital. I've already mentioned Anti-Düring, but a huge amount of Marx and Engels certainly wasn't published in the history of the Second International. And we know indeed, I can remember the impact that the publication of what was called the Young Marx made on the left, because this was often first published in my lifetime, i.e. the Grundrisse, or I think there was a German edition that was produced in the 50s, but in terms of the translation, in terms of English, it was later. And certainly, the early works of Marx and Engels, this was something that caused a shock amongst many, not least official communism. And as Istvan Meszaros explained in his book, it led to the invention of this idea of a young, idealistic Marx who believed in democracy and freedom, and then the mature, scientific Marx who wasn't interested in issues of morality, freedom, democracy, and simply looked at the development of the means of production as being the main social driver. It was the means of production excuse me while I have a cough, that would somehow free us. You find echoes of that in an impoverished form in people like, I don't know whether he still comes out with this stuff, but people like Paul Mason, Aaron Bastani, and similar such stuff. But as Istvan Meszaros, I think, successfully showed, there wasn't a young Marx. Well, of course, there was a young Marx, but there wasn't this epistemological break that Althusser and official communism wrote about, that separated capital from the Communist Manifesto, the German ideology, and other such works. So when it came to the question of war and peace, what we have is very little that's known when it comes to 1914. So we do have some of Marx's writings, and including letters published around the Crimean War. We have collections put together showing that Marx was a dedicated opponent of Russian Tsarism, which is true, an advocate of revolutionary, I emphasize the word revolutionary, war against Russia. And this was theorized, let me get his name right, Alexander Prokofiev. I haven't got my notes. I need glasses when I'm reading my handwriting nowadays. Either way, the point would be, this is what Lenin inherits. And when we look at Lenin, we shouldn't be looking at someone who has evadable all of Marx and Engels. Lenin is a Marx-Engels loyalist. There's no doubt about that. So he wants to, wherever possible, stay true to the word of Marx and Engels, not because he's a dogmatist, but because he thinks, he thinks highly of the writings of Marx and Engels. And if you disagree with them, there has to be a very good reason to disagree. So what Lenin generally does is look at the writings of Marx and Engels and then tries to square it with what he understands ought to be the position of the working class in terms of the Second International, and above all, in terms of the collapse of the Second International. As we know, the Second International, I think, is justifiably famous for its championing of peace, but not just any peace. There's an expectation not only of colonial wars, but what we would now call inter-imperialist wars between the great powers. And what the Second International does is that we should turn this expected war against the rule of capital. And you get various proposals. Lenin doesn't think much of it, but a general strike, for example, against war. Lenin is much more in favor of turning imperialist war into civil war, into a revolution. Either way, he attempts to square that with his understanding of the writings of Marx and Engels. And hence you get in the pamphlet jointly published with Grigory Zinoviev, Socialism and War, is this periodization of capitalism and its wars. And so you get this idea from Lenin that capitalist wars before 1871, that's the Paris Commune, of course, I emphasize the word can have a progressive character. And this is how Lenin explains Marx's admiring remarks about the wars by revolutionary France in Europe. Excuse me. His well-known support and campaigning for the northern side in the US Civil War, the US Second Revolution. His initial support for Prussia, for Germany, in the what was called the Franco-Prussian or Franco-German War of 1870. But Lenin's argument is, with 1871, with the decisive emergence of the working class, then in general, the wars conducted by the big capitalist powers then just become reactionary. And so Lenin is able then to deal with the idea being propagated in Germany in particular, both by some on the left of social democracy, but also by the right of social democracy, that Marx was a dedicated opponent of Tsarism, true, and was dedicated to any war directed against Tsarism, untrue. So if we actually examine Marx's and Engels's writings in the Crimea War, while they want to see the defeat of Tsarism, they actually are not enthusiasts, not for the Ottoman Empire, that's certainly true, but nor for France and nor for Britain. So they're not wanting to choose sides. And this is certainly something that, if we look at the writings of Marx and Engels, that we can see in their attitude to Russia. And indeed, their view of Russia changes from Russia being the bulwark of reaction, which is the role it certainly played from in 1815 onwards. But if you look at the last joint preface to the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels speculate, I think correctly, not only about a coming war, but Russia actually playing a vanguard role, that the revolutionary forces in Russia are on the cusp of overthrowing Tsarism, and Russia would therefore act as the trigger for the European revolution. And certainly, if we look at what Lenin was saying in 1914, that was very much his message, which of course wasn't unique to Lenin. You can find it in Kautsky's writings on Russia, after 1905, which made him, from the Bolshevik point of view, something of a honorary Bolshevik, until, of course, 1914, August 1914. Okay, 3/4 of an hour. Okay. Right. Okay, just taking a step back, we now have a situation where we do have more or less, I think, everything that Marx and Engels wrote. And what I would argue, I think would be correct, is that if we look at Marx and Engels, what they were promoting wasn't so much the victory of this or that side, in terms of the means of production, but the promotion of this or that side as an exception in terms of what was in the interests of forming the working class into a class, first of all, in itself, and then for itself. So, for example, if we look at their policy in the United States, Marx and Engels, in particular Marx, was very aware that, yes, for the North, this wasn't a war against slavery. That was something that he was advocating from the very beginning. The Marx-Engels party was in no small part responsible, because of their international contacts, of getting Abraham Lincoln elected as president. Red 48ers, including old friends of Marx and Engels, fought with the Northern Army, always urging that the North use the trump card, which is the freeing of the slaves, which is something Lincoln eventually did. But Marx in particular was well aware that having developed the Northern Army, having developed the Northern Navy, having overcome the South, having made the United States genuinely independent of Britain, the United States would become a rival to Britain and an imperialist power in its own right, and would not only expand to the west and take over the lands of the Plains Indians, but would look to the south, would look to the Pacific, would look to extend its power as a rival and a replacement hegemon for Britain. And that, of course, wasn't something that Marx and Engels were promoting. What they were promoting is, yes, the interests of forming the working class as a class for itself in the north of the United States, but also in Britain and in Europe. And of course, being based in Britain, being the leader of the First International, Marx and Engels played a leading role in winning the working class to take the northern side, to oppose its own government that actually wanted to align Britain directly with the South in the war. They were supportive. They applauded the cotton workers in the north of England, who instituted a boycott of southern cotton, for example, even though it meant that they suffered as a result of it. They knew, the workers themselves knew that victory for the North would involve them in temporary suffering, including unemployment. That was something that the working class in Britain had been won to support. So the working class was being, yes, formed into a class for itself. And that is what we need to understand about Marx and Engels. And if you form the working class into a class for itself, by definition, that has to go hand in hand with a definite foreign policy, not an unchanging foreign policy, but a foreign policy that precisely pursues and advances the universal interests of the working class. So if we're looking for fixity, you won't find it. What we need to understand is precisely policy and policy changes. So, for example, to illustrate the point, what we have is different attitudes by Marx and Engels to the Irish question, not because finally they came out with the correct line, but precisely because circumstances were changing, both in Ireland, also in Britain, and also the United States. So, for example, one of the largest national minorities in the United States during the Second Revolution, during the Civil War, was the Irish population. And the Irish population actually had a pretty good idea that if the slaves were freed, they would be competing with black labor, free black labor. Hence, they opposed conscription. And Marx and Engels in London are raising the Irish question in order to win the Irish working class in America, to support their foreign policy in the United States for a northern victory, not because they want to, swell the coffers of the capitalist class, but because they want to form the working class in the United States into a class. And that had to include not only different nationalities, but different skin colors. I think it says it in capital, while black labor is enslaved, white labor can never be free. And that was true also in Britain itself. So you see Engels, for example, in his so-called critique of the Earthort program, actually advocate federalism, for example, not the independence of Ireland, but a federal relationship in the British Isles. I'm just going to switch my light on. And I think I'm coming to a close. Okay, so last point. In Socialism and War, the joint pamphlet by Lenin and Zinoviev, we not only get a periodization that needs questioning, but we also get, which I don't think needs questioning, is a denunciation of what they call social chauvinism or social imperialism. And that is that section of the leadership of the working class that is joined with the bourgeoisie and has adopted its foreign policy. And that would include, in Britain, people such as Henry Hyman, the leader of, I think it would have been at the time, well, the Social Democratic Federation is what we'd know it of, later becomes the British Socialist Party, which later becomes the main component of the CPGB. Lenin denounces these leaders, but explains why these leaders have gone over, and a section of the working class, in my view, with a false theory. Something that Tony Cliff pointed out long ago. His theory was that the working class in the big powers benefited from the crumbs of the imperialist table. And in particular, what he singled out was not only the upper layer of the working class in terms of leaders, but what he called the labor aristocracy. And what he meant by that wasn't Northern Irish Protestants or white workers in South Africa. What he meant by that specifically would be, for example, engineering workers. Should be pointed out that these were amongst the first sections of the working class in Britain to rebel against the war. These people set up shop stewards committees, and they carried out, okay, I admit it, economic strikes, but economic strikes in the midst of an inter-imperialist war clearly were political. And what happened to the leaders of these strikes is they were deported to other parts of the country, and many of these individuals go on to become important founders of the CPGB. I think actually Zinoviev actually had a better take on why we had social imperialism in his pamphlet called The Social Roots of Opportunism, and that was with bureaucracy. That bureaucracy bred conservatism, bred a petty bourgeois lifestyle. I actually prefer that as an explanation. Either way, what I want to emphasize is that Zinoviev and Lenin and the Bolsheviks not only characterized themselves with their denunciation of social imperialism, joining your own side, but also social pacifism. And that included centrism of the Trotsky sort, which sought to maintain some sort of unity with the social pacifists who wanted to retain a unity with the social imperialists. Lenin demanded split, split, split. And that would include, if necessary, a split with the social pacifists. That wasn't hard and fast, but that was the approach. So if we look at the formation of the Third International, that most certainly was the approach. Either way, what we had is individuals such as in Britain, Keir Hardie, who opposed the war. Okay, he was a good Christian and said that Jesus turned the other cheek and preached, "Thou shalt not kill." I cannot, tell you to kill the German boys on the other side. But you also had More surprisingly, I suppose, to some, Ramsay MacDonald, who also came out with a social pacifist line. He suffered terrible consequences as a result of it. As my understanding is, he was expelled from his golf club in Scotland. The other golfers refused to play around with him. But we also had, more typically, in Germany, the leader, the historic leader, the Pope of Marxism himself, Karl Kautsky, who wasn't a social chauvinist, as many people wrongly call him. He was a social pacifist, and he would have been much more of the line of, well, the war will be over by Christmas, party unity can be restored after this madness. He actually urged the Reichstag faction to abstain in terms of war credits, not to vote for them, to abstain. The faction came out wanting to vote for war credits. Karl Liebknecht actually did vote for war credits first time. Then he rebelled, and then others joined him. But what Lenin was doing was denouncing social pacifism. And what I want to do is precisely say why. Because in Lenin's view, that social pacifism was misleading the working class, One, that unity could be restored and should be restored with the social imperialist right, that we want party unity again with the Hendersons, with those that have done a deal with the German high command. Lenin was saying, no, we want to split with these people. So Lenin was saying that social pacifism misleads the working class. It also misleads the working class in the way that Kautsky came out with in his notorious pamphlet, Ultra Imperialism, published in 1914, that predicted a peaceful future for capitalism as monopoly added to monopoly, and the capitalists just divide up the world peacefully. That capitalism can go hand in hand with peace. And as Lenin insisted time and time again, no, capitalism goes hand in hand with war. He might have periodized it wrongly, but that was something he insisted on. And he insisted on it basically, by quoting Clausewitz, war is the continuation of policy. It's the continuation of the same policy, but using violent means. Okay, final couple of minutes. What I want to do, and what Lenin did, is distinguish between what I would call the just pacifism, the justified pacifism of the masses, in contrast between the unjustified, wrong, misleading pacifism of the likes of Keir Hardie, Ramsay MacDonald, and Karl Kautsky. And that is the pacifism, if I can describe it as that, of Thucydides in the Trojan War. Fuck your war. Why are we dying in your war for booty and slavery? When it comes to World War I, what you'll find is some really great writings, by the way, by Trotsky on trench warfare, and saying that what exists in the trenches, and he's in France and he's reporting as a sort of journalist, he's meeting people on trains, he describes fraternization, not just in terms of Christmas, but the live and let live that goes on between the quiet fronts. I'm not going to shoot you when you're having a cigarette at night. I'm not going to take a pot shot at you when you're cleaning out your trenches because they've been flooded by rain. So the Bolsheviks, people like Trotsky, the left is promoting fraternization. And I'm also reminded, in terms of my own history, as a young communist, someone also who then goes in to the lens, but very much, molded, very indirectly as a very, very young person by the Vietnam War and what was going on, not only on our TV screens, from the BBC, shot in a completely biased, one-sided fashion. But there you are, you had these monstrous pictures of B-52s just dropping bombs on Vietnamese villages and jungles because the Viet Cong were down there. B-52s patrolling over North Vietnam and raining terror down upon them. But also we had a trickle back, didn't we, of what ordinary soldiers thought of it. And this took, the form also, which is what particularly I can recall, of what was going on. I know it doesn't play the same role it does nowadays in terms of the availability of music and all the rest of it, but it had a big impact on me, believe it or not. Well, what was going on with Top of the Pops, which we all watched, at least us young people, every week, if I'm not mistaken, at Thursday, wasn't it on Thursday? Either way, what I recall from this period is a record, just worthwhile using it to illustrate my point, by a certain Alvin Starr. And this is, of course, War. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing. War. And all the rest of it. An anthem, a call in that sense to take up arms, to militantly oppose America's war in Vietnam. It was a black singer. It'd previously been recorded by the Temptations. This is a Motown operation. But the management thought that the Temptations had such a family reputation that releasing that song as a single, as people were calling for, would ruin their commercial prospects. So Alvin Starr actually volunteered to record the record. He did record it. It got to number one in, what do they call it in America? Number one in the Billboard. I presume that must have been a music paper. Either way, it got to number one. It was something that was broadcast, in Britain. We all took it as it was, an anti-Vietnam War hymn, a protest song. And it has an interesting after history, I think, at least. Alvin Starr ended up moving to Britain. He ended up in a place called Nottingham. I don't know why Nottingham. Either way, he re-records this song, and it has a further history. Stop the War Coalition sponsored a pressing of a version of it recorded by a group called Ugly Rumours. Ugly Rumours is worthwhile mentioning because, of course, this was a piss take of Tony Blair, who in his younger days was the lead singer of a group called Ugly Rumours when he was at Oxford University. Either way, this song wasn't quite the hit of Alvin Starr. I think it got to number 26. But the point I'm making is that this was played on Stop the War Coalition demonstrations, before or between or after speakers. And I can recall, I don't know who I was next to, maybe some left communists or some anarchists, I can't recall. There I was, though, listening to this music. And of course, I go straight back to 1970 and the original, hit single by Alvin Starr. There it is, Ugly Rumours, with apparently, I must have been so away from the stage I couldn't see it, but with a Tony Blair lookalike as the lead singer. I don't know how, whether it was recorded by white artists. I just don't know who it was in terms of their Ugly Rumours group. But yeah, the comrades around me were mocking it and were saying, what's war good for? What about the class war? What about wars of national liberation? Precisely, they missed the point. They missed the difference between social pacifism as preached by Keir Hardie by Karl Kautsky, even, by centrists, and the sentiments of the masses, that when soldiers fraternize, when soldiers say, what's this war good for? Absolutely nothing. This is a sentiment that we need to take on board. And the last thing we do is to mock it. Quite the contrary. So hence, if we look at the famous Bolshevik slogan of 1916, which of course doesn't come out of nowhere, land, bread and peace, land to the peasantry, bread to the workers, peace to the soldiers. And I'll finish with that, Gabby. Thank you very much.